Welcome to this educational review on leg length studies. This is actually a stitching exam, and we're going to be covering this on the GE equipment. He describes this as an image pasting study, and this is a long leg study. So if it doesn't populate for you, this is how you actually pull this up for the correct settings for a leg length study on GE equipment. What is a leg length study? A leg length study is actually an exam that is ordered because we're concerned that the patient isn't growing at the same rate in both limbs. So it's going to include both lower extremities, and we're going to use the lead ruler seen here with all of the lead numbers taped into the middle of the image, right down the middle, so that you can see it between the legs. It's also really important that we don't have shoes on our patient. So I've already moved the scoliosis leg length board over. If needed, there's a little step that they can stand on that will put them at the right height. Of course, my skeleton doesn't fit on the step, so I removed it for this image. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the equipment, I'm going to show you where I'm going to position. So it's super important to include my hips on this, and on the GE equipment, it's not the top of my light field, it's actually that red laser beam. So I'm going to put that line, that red line, at the top of my patient's hips, or about the level of the ASIS. So what anatomy is going to be covered on this? I'm going to see both legs from the hip all the way down to the ankle, and that includes the lateral malleolus. So I should see that ankle joint, and the ruler should go down as far as the ankles. An important piece of communication with your patient is to tell them to evenly place their weight between both legs. We don't want all of your weight on one patient's leg, or it can mess with the study. So essentially, we're scanning the patient with the x-ray tube. It's going to move down from the hip all the way to the ankles. And a fun piece of radiologic history is it actually has been called a scanogram in the past. So if your order says leg length scanogram, you probably have a physician ordering this who has been in the field for quite a while. So let's talk about the specifics of the equipment. So here we have our standing scoliosis leg length board, and this works the same as a scoliosis study. These nice little bars over to the side are not just a safety precaution for the patient to hold on to, but it actually has information. So we're going to imagine a line shooting over from this handlebar to the patient, and wherever that line would line up with the middle of the thickness of their thigh, then that is the number that we're going to program into the actual x-ray tube. Why do we put that number in there? It improves image quality and also the processing of this exam. So I've used the plus sign to bump this up to a 4.0. Now I'm going to move on to actually setting the field of exposure. So remember, I'm going to set the top of my light of exposure by lining up the red line where I want the top of that exposure to be. So that can be a little confusing. All of this area up in the patient's abdomen will not be exposed during the actual exposure. That red line is our guide for that. So back to the x-ray tube, I have it set on 4.0. If I need to reset that at any moment, it's this arrow, but I'm going to keep it at 4.0. Once I have my tube where I want it for the top of my exposure, I'm going to select the icon where the x-ray tube is pointed at the patient's head. That means this is the top of the image I'm about to acquire. I can then move my tube to the lower portion of my patient's body, remembering to include both ankles. I'm now going to select the icon with the tube pointed towards the patient's feet. This means this is the bottom of my exposure area. So the next step after selecting that lower portion icon is going to be this check mark portion, and that just basically sets it all together. Once you hit that check mark icon, you're going to see this screen displayed, which means you are all ready for your next step of exposure. So don't forget, you're going to keep holding down on the exposure button until you have not one, not two, but 3 separate exposures that happen. The tube is going to move down with the image receptor at the same time and take 3 exposures, allowing the equipment to stitch all of the images together as seen here. Now this is not as pretty as a real image, but it gives you an idea. I couldn't unrotate my skeleton's legs. He's been through some things. Just as any other exam on the GE digital equipment, you can annotate your image with a digital marker, say if yours did not show up, and you also have the ability to reprocess your images. Now, the factory levels are how the image displays how it's processed. So if your image looks a little light or a little off, you can always go through and change the factory level. The GE equipment has a really good track record of making things show up exactly as they were exposed. We don't have a lot of errors, but in case that happens to you, I'm going to show you how to fix it. So let me explain how the equipment stitches images together. There is a digital point on each image where the equipment knows to match the image or superimpose at that exact spot. So here in this upper image, this red crosshair is the exact same spot that will be over this spot here in the lower second image. It's very helpful. I have a ruler so I can line them up and reprocess for a quality image. This is how the equipment automatically stitches your image together. So that's exactly how it should look. After you process, you will get a brand new image. Now, I'm a really big believer in if you know how to mess something up, sometimes you know how to fix it. So this is a good image. Let me show you how to mess it up, and feel free to come into the GE equipment and do the same thing so that you can learn how to fix it in case this ever happens to you on a real image. Bring up the bean or the processing and move one of the crosshairs away from the point that it should be. So you don't want these to superimpose. Now watch what happens to my image. It's actually gonna split this image and distort it to the point where it looks like my patient's legs were cut in half here. So your image would definitely have something wrong with it if it comes up looking like this. You don't need to re-expose the patient. You can come into the bean or the reprocessing icon and fix those two crosshairs that we just saw in the last section. So I'm going to move this crosshair over to where it should be using my ruler and reprocess one time. GE says that this happens about 1 in 500 images, which is a really good track record. So there is a possibility that this may never happen to you. If it does, though, you're prepared on how to fix it. Don't forget there's also a cheat sheet on how to do this all together if you would rather learn by reading. So here we have a little bit better of an example. This is a real life image I just pulled off of Google. This shows our patient with the hip joints exposed all the way down to the ankle joints. The weight is evenly distributed, and we have that ruler with the lead markers all the way down the center of the patient. So the skeleton isn't a good example of what actual anatomy looks like, but this is. If your images look like this, you have a good quality exam.